Hello and welcome. I'm Erika Bakyaki, founder and director of the Wollstonecraft Project at the Abigail Adams Institute, our host for this event and the publisher of Fair Disputations. Before I introduce our editor, Serena Sigillito, who will introduce our panelists and moderate this event, I want to just say a few words about the Abigail Adams Institute and the Wollstonecraft Project. So AAI is a scholarly institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that serves the Harvard community and other universities in the greater Boston area. The Wollstonecraft Project at AAI studies questions of sexual equality and freedom and virtue, rights, and responsibilities from a sex-realist position, as inspired by the thought of the late 18th century English philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft. We host lectures on these topics at Harvard each year, offer an intensive week-long summer seminar entitled Theorizing Man and Woman from Plato to Judith Butler, and award an academic fellowship each year to a scholar pursuing work in this area. Information about all of these offerings and the applications for those can be found at abigailadamsinstitute.org. So today, in an effort to bring together leading sex-realist feminists from the UK and the US, and one hopes to advance the new feminist cause in our own countries and beyond, the Wollstonecraft Project officially launches our new online journal, Fair Disputations. Fair Disputations aggregates, and in time will publish, popular and scholarly articles dedicated to defending a vision of female and male as embodied expressions of human personhood, with special focus on the current threats to women and girls from sex trafficking and prostitution, pornography, trans ideology, and reproductive technology. Though united in an understanding that biological sex is real, we publish an array of perspectives from a diverse group of featured authors and others on how society ought properly to accommodate that reality. If you haven't already done so, please visit the site and subscribe to our weekly email. And of course, there's a donation button there as well. So to introduce our esteemed panelists, who all serve as featured authors at Fair Disputations, I want to turn the program over to Serena Sigillito, the journal's editor. Serena brings a wealth of experience to this new post from her position as editor of the online journal Public Discourse. But before I relinquish the reins, just a quick word of thanks to Erin Holmes, who designed our lovely site, and to Rose Elvidge, a doctoral student in philosophy at Oxford, who brought the idea of Fair Disputations to me more than a year ago and now serves as our associate editor. So my gratitude to Erin, Rose, Serena, and everyone at AAI for your work over these last several months. Okay, Serena, over to you.
Thanks so much, Erika. Well, I am very pleased and excited to welcome our wonderful group of panelists. We're going to start with Louise Perry, who is a journalist and the director and co-founder of The Other Half, which is a nonpartisan feminist think tank based in London. Her best-selling book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, was published in 2022. After Louise, we will have Abigail Favale, who's a writer, speaker, and professor at the McGrath Institute at the University of Notre Dame. Her much-acclaimed book, The Genesis of Gender, was also published in 2022. Next up, we have Leah Libresco Sergeant, who is a writer and speaker who founded the Other Feminism Substack. She works also for the citizen organization Braver Angels. She's currently working on a book on the ways in which the world treats women as defective men. Next up, we have the filmmaker Jennifer Lahl, who is the founder and president of the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network, where she has produced several significant documentaries focused on donor conception, egg donation, surrogacy, gender-affirming medicine, and other bioethical issues. Next, we'll have Mary Harrington, who's a UK-based writer and contributing editor at Unheard, where she has a weekly column. She also runs the Reactionary Feminist Substack. Her forthcoming book, Feminism Against Progress, focuses on women's rights in the biotech age. Next, we have an exciting late-breaking addition, Helen Joyce, who is the Director of Advocacy for Sex Matters, a nonprofit that campaigns for sex-based rights in the UK. She's author of the best-selling 2021 book, Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality. That was listed as a bestseller at Times of London and Spectator Books of the Year, and in the UK and Amazon, which was both in the top 10. Last up, we have Nina Power, who is an English writer and philosopher. She is currently senior editor and columnist at the online magazine Compact. Her most recent book, What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents, was published in 2022. So the format for today will be focused around a single question. That question flows from our mission statement. So Fair Disputation aims to advance sex-realist feminism for the 21st century. We believe that to really serve women and girls, feminism has to correspond to who we are as human beings. Human beings are always and everywhere embodied, and our sex is an essential and unchangeable aspect of our bodies. In short, sex is real and it matters. With this basic definition as a starting point, I now want to ask each of our panelists to reflect on how they came to embrace a sex-realist feminist perspective and how they hope Fairer Disputations will advance the cause. So Louise, I will pass the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Serena and Erika. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, excellent. I'm so delighted to be a part of this, and the fact that this is happening as an actual collection of some of the most, I think, interesting writers of on this topic in the world, and all joined from different time zones, which is completely appropriate. So the question of how I came to arrive at sex-realist feminism, certainly not immediately, I can say that. So my background is as a women's studies student. When I was at Oxford, very much the mainstream view within my department was what I think we should call a liberal feminist view. It's a slightly disputed term, liberal feminism, because obviously liberalism is a hugely disputed term, and generally liberal feminists don't self-describe in that way. But I think that it's the right term to use, because I think that what we're talking about is the feminist instantiation of liberalism. You know, despite the fact that that term is up for debate, it describes something real, and its feminist version is the air that we breathe generally within, particularly within academia, particularly within the West. And it was obviously the air that I was breathing as a young student, and I chose very eccentrically to specialize in the study of women's medicine, and in the history of obstetrics in particular. And I remember so vividly being told by fellow students and sometimes by faculty that this was a niche thing to study. This was a peculiar thing to study. I was almost alone in my cohort in showing an interest in this, because of course the most fashionable areas of study in gender departments. I mean, so my degree was still called women's studies at the time. It no longer is. Most of these departments are now called gender studies departments, or gender and sexuality studies, or whatever. The use of the word woman is considered archaic. By far the most fashionable things to study are to do with performance, are all in some way derived from Judith Butler, and are to do with our superficial displays of gender, particularly when it comes to clothing, mannerisms, etc., etc. Whereas something like women's medicine, which has nothing to do with the superficial and the performed, which is all to do with urgently material matters, was very much outside of the mainstream. And I guess that was one of the, for whatever reason, that was what I was interested in. I wasn't a mother at the time. Becoming a mother 19 months ago only strengthened my view that any understanding of men and women has to begin with a recognition of fundamental sexual asymmetry. Sexual asymmetry in terms of our size, our physical strength, which is of course hugely important when you're thinking about violence and our different abilities to participate in the labour market. But also the fact that women are the ones who get pregnant. And even though the pill is this transformative technology, which is basically the basis of my book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, I think that the pill is the great intervention into the relationship between men and women, because for the first time in the history of the world, you have women, most of us, moving in the world as women who appear to be fertile but are in fact not fertile, have suspended our fertility. The technology that allows us to do that is, I think, so much more transformative than we've really reckoned with as a society. And so my book was an attempt to reckon with that and to conclude that the downstream consequences of the pill have been mixed, to say the best. The recognition that sexual asymmetry is at the heart of feminist analysis is deeply uncomfortable if what you are attempting to do with your feminist project is to erase differences between men and women, is to be radically egalitarian, not just in the sense of giving certain legal rights on an equal footing, not just in the sense of equality of opportunity, but in the sense of women having the ability to actually be like men. This is a promise that the pill seems to offer. It's a promise that all of the various technologies that erase the differences in our working lives and our social lives seems to offer, but it's a promise that can never actually be fulfilled, because the strange paradox is that even at the exact same moment that we've had the rise of the transgender movement, that we've had the push from liberal feminism towards greater and greater radicalism in our egalitarian hopes, we've also had increasing medical research demonstrating the extent to which we are different at the cellular level, men and women, and ever more moves towards having gender-specific pharmaceuticals, gender-specific medicine of all kinds. It is now clearer and clearer from a scientific perspective that women are not just smaller men, and that actually there are ways in which we are radically different from one another physically and psychologically. And the strange thing is that our politics at the exact same moment has been moving in the opposite direction. But I don't think that that's sustainable. I think that the recognition of sexual asymmetry isn't something that can be ignored for too long. And I hope that this platform and everyone else working in this space is a move towards bringing us back to sanity and reality when it comes to feminism. So
thank you so much, Louise. That was really fascinating. Abigail, we're going to move on to you next.
Okay, great. Well, like Louise, I studied in the UK. I have a background in feminist theory and gender studies, but my master's program was in women, writing, and gender. So you've got women and gender there. So I think it was sort of a transitional moment. I'm guessing I'm a little older than Louise. And I remember in having a seminar on, we were reading one of the French postmodernists, the male French postmodernists, and I think it might have been Derrida or Levinas. And in this particular essay, this philosopher was writing as a woman, right? He was kind of stepping into the empty discursive space that is woman. And so we sat around the table basically saying, like, can you do that? Can you just step into the space that is woman? And it was unanimous. We all said, no, you can't just do that. Like, there's something, yes, there is this process of social construction that happens in the way that sex is articulated and interpreted in the world, but there's something foundational about it. You can't just appropriate a female voice like that. Well, I mean, that was in the early 2000s, and now you absolutely can, right? That has almost become the popular orthodoxy. And so in my own work, I've just been fascinated by that transition, like how quickly that has changed to the idea that I guess almost the sentiment or the intuition that no, sex is real. You can't just step into the voice of a woman or the experience of a woman or the category of woman to, oh, yes, you can. And if you don't agree, you're a terrible person, right? I mean, that's just a fascinating transformation. So in my own work, I have looked into the intellectual history about how this has changed and looking at the concept of gender and how it's developed and how what a complicated history and short history it has already been. So we have in the mid 20th century, we've got Simone de Beauvoir, who introduces, I think, the concept that gender would soon come to name, even though she doesn't actually use the term gender, in her book, The Second Sex. But she makes this distinction between woman and female, right? In her famous line, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So she's making a distinction there between the fact of femaleness and then the way femaleness is framed and interpreted in society. And that's a helpful distinction, right? Because not everything that is attached to the label woman is strictly natural or strictly biological. And so then second wave feminism adopted this sex gender split, right? So sex refers to biology, gender refers to the social construction or the social interpretation of sex. That seems like a straightforward and helpful distinction to make. But then in the late 80s and early 90s, through the work mainly of Judith Butler, we get this argument that no, not only is gender a complete social construction, but sex itself, right? So the word female is just as troubled as the word woman. And so that, I think, is a really crucial turn. And Judith Butler's she's a radical social constructionist, right? So for her, nothing is natural. Everything is linguistic. Everything is socially constructed. And I think that most people don't really think that way, right? So how has that philosophy become so powerful? Well, one thing that's, I think, even more fascinating is that in our time, we now have the concept of gender identity theory, which seems to assert a new kind of essentialism. It's almost this complete reversal of the sex gender split in second wave feminist theory, because now sex is the construct, right? But gender is real. Gender is so profoundly real. And it's defined as this inner self concept that not only do you know at a very young age, but it can actually be at odds with your socialization. I mean, that's fascinating. That's very different from what Butler was saying, right? So there's almost this pre-social soul that we have that is our gender. Whereas sex, that's the construct. That's something we impose on the body. That's a false category. So that reversal, that bewildering reversal, I think is really fascinating and obviously troubling. And I think the panelists here will give some of the reasons why, practically speaking, it's not good for women if we forget the reality of sex. And so I think what has really happened is that the concept of gender has supplanted sex. And because it's not grounded in anything concrete or anything real, it can constantly morph and change meanings. And then it becomes really easy to deploy it in very strategic ways. So that's a little window into my work. I will say, in addition to the practical things, the practical problems with this idea of gender, I'm also just really annoyed by the intellectual vacuousness of it and the illogic and the constant equivocation. And that just really bothers me as a person. So that's one reason why I'm continually fascinated by this discussion.
Thank you, Abigail. Next up, can we have Leah Libresco Sergeant?
It's my pleasure. I'm Leah Libresco Sergeant. I run Other Feminisms, a Substack that's really focused for advocating for women to be welcome in the world as women. And I think what happens too often is that when we look for a sex-neutral way of setting up the world, what we wind up with is a male-normed way of setting up the world, where we set up a neutral that fits women less well than it fits men. And then we punish women for not fitting into a model that was never made for us. So to a certain extent, what we have is not a sex-realist world. We have a world that is a male-normed world where women are defective men. And it's our job to kind of remedy those deficiencies as best we can and to try and cover up the cost of remedying those deficiencies. You can see that, at the very obvious level of fertility, where a woman's need for extra care after birth, for a particular bond with her baby isn't supported, where the woman's whole fertility system is treated as a weird structural defect of women that women are responsible for remedying in a way that doesn't inconvenience anyone else. But I'm also really indebted to the work of women like Caroline Criado Perez and Maya Dusenberry, who talk a lot about how the built world, the medical world, just doesn't even start from the perspective that women exist. Ms. Criado Perez has written a lot about how the design of cars, the design of tools will be normed to a male hand, to male proportions, so that a female surgeon will have more trouble working adeptly because neutral tools are made for hands that are larger than her own. And then on the other end, as a patient, Maya Dusenberry writes about how many medical trials are conducted without any women in the sample at all, because to include women in a study of a drug runs the risk of it being harder or needing more participants, because a woman's natural cycles will throw off how the medicine interacts. You need more people to make sure you're working out all those kinks, and then you wind up with a drug where they didn't want to know how it interacted with a woman's fertility, and then they prescribe it to women based on male data. So the reason I care about sex realism is I think we live in a sex-blind world that is blind selectively to women. And a lot of the work we have to do is to give women a way of imagining that something better is possible. That women have done real difficult work to say, how can I best fit these norms that don't fit me? And then I hope you're not asking me to give up kind of the crutches I'm relying on to navigate this unfair, biased world. But a lot of those crutches are fundamentally unjust. They're unjust demands placed on women, saying you can't be welcome here as a woman. You can't be welcome here with your natural fertility. We don't just want to get you better and better crutches, better and better disguises to fit into a male norm. We want you to be able to live fully and vividly as yourself.
Thank you so much, Leah. Next up, we have Jennifer Lahl.
Good morning. It's morning here in California, at least.
And we appreciate you getting.
Thank you. No, I'm delighted to be involved and invited to participate in this new project and with these amazing women that I'm excited to work with. I came to do the work that I do in sort of a roundabout way. I was happily working in academic clinical medicine, in pediatric critical care, and I decided to pursue a graduate degree in bioethics because I was in clinical nursing in university hospitals where you're always pushing the envelope, you're always looking for the next technology cure. I worked with this surgeon in San Francisco who did the first removing the baby from the mother's womb and did the surgical repair and put the baby back in the mother's womb so that the baby could be born without this horrible defect. And but I became increasingly concerned with what I saw happening in medicine. The old, just because you can do it, should we do it? And I'm always interested in the conversations that happen around the intersection of science, technology, medicine, ethics. So I entered the discipline of bioethics at the height of the George Bush presidency in the United States. Dolly the sheep had just been cloned. Bill Joy had just written a prescient article in Wired magazine on why the future didn't need us anymore with the advances in AI and robotics and nanotechnology. I still remember a heated debate at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco where a scientist at Carnegie Mellon challenged Bill Joy to give back all the money that he made on advancing this technology. So it was a really spirited time. But I realized that in the United States and certainly elsewhere around the world, this whole debate around advancing a human cloning and an embryonic stem cell scientific endeavor, really the linchpin was women's reproductive bodies. How was it that in the United States, we had at that time 500,000 frozen embryos, and the United Kingdom had 1 million because the United Kingdom was ahead of us on assisted reproductive technology with the birth of Louise Brown. I was concerned about who was going to win. If you look at the new patents that were being claimed and gobbled up by the scientists, Irv Weissman at Stanford University holds numerous patents that were being developed, but at the expense of women's reproductive bodies. How else are you going to advance cures for everybody, cures for the world, this personalized medicine without having young women lining up, donating their eggs? And I was worried about the two markets because before this cloning and stem cell debate, the market for women's reproductive bodies was fertility clinics, helping people have babies. But we saw a bifurcation of that market or an expansion of that market with the scientific, endeavors. And of course, that's a different profile. You know, the fertility clinic wants the Ivy League, beautiful, talented, disease-free, healthy young woman. Whereas the bench researcher doesn't really care so much about that. He just needs lots and lots of eggs. So that, of course, will marginalize, you know, women of color, women who aren't Ivy League educated. And so it was then that I really took this deep dive into fertility medicine to see what is really going on here in this attempt to help people have babies. And what I saw in my work, in my writing, and my speaking was all the harm. And of course, as a nurse, that was really concerning to me. And the more I wrote and the more I spoke, the more I heard from women. I sold my eggs, and this is what happened to me. I rented my womb, and this is what happened to me. And I started reading contracts and trying to understand better the laws around who was protected, and you know how the laws privilege the moneyed interest. And you know that was deeply concerning to me, again, because of my interest in women's health, in maternal child health, my interest in children that were created through assisted reproductive technology. And I'm seeing more and more shifts because in a post-Dobbs ruling, especially here in the United States, we have now the introduction of the Right to Build a Family Act of 2022, which we've never had federal legislation around assisted reproductive technology in the US, but in an attempt to protect and codify people's rights to build a family, we have an advancement of a federal structure in the law. We have the development of the bipartisan family building caucus. And it's, you know, and these legislations and caucuses are being introduced by Tammy Duckworth, who was a military vet who was wounded in the military, who was trying to get access to our military to assisted reproduction so that they can build a family. We know that, you know, same-sex couples can now access reproductive technologies. So it was in that space I formed the Center for Bioethics and Culture. I quickly decided to move into documentary filmmaking. Maybe my writing and academic friends will not like to hear me say this, but people today don't really read. But you can often get them to watch a movie. And it's through our filmmaking that we encourage the conversation. We tell the stories that we know the mainstream media won't tell. We tell the stories of the people that were harmed, the women that were harmed, the children that were harmed. I like to say, you know, we're women until we're not. If you go through the catalogs looking for an egg donor or a surrogate mother, you'll find catalogs of women. You won't find catalogs of men who tell you they're a woman. If you're doing a new clinical trial on a drug therapy for women, the clinical trial will recruit biological women. So we know what sex is. And I'm going to just conclude with, I think, what I see coming in this right to build a family language. We're moving at breakneck speed to create artificial wombs. There was the little video that went viral a few weeks ago on the Ectopod, the Ecto-Life Pod. I think it's been viewed like 2 million times. Gestating babies on artificial wombs. Synthetic egg and synthetic sperm are around the corner. We're already, you know, creating animals using synthetic eggs and synthetic sperm and growing them in artificial wombs. Will we be erased? Will we become obsolete? We won't even be needed. You know, we have the pill that allowed us to have sex without having babies. And now we have technology that will allow us to have babies without even having sex, and machines that will grow those babies. So I think I'm most excited about this group and our collective voices and our collective interests in advancing the right to protect women, the right to be women, the right to say out loud that we are women. So I think I'll conclude with that, and I'll welcome the conversations we have after.
Yeah, and that's something that our next speaker, Mary Harrington, has written about, that erasure of women. So I will hand it over to Mary. Thank you, Jennifer. I think you are still muted, Mary.
Sorry, I'm so
There we
sorry.
go.
Here I am. That's better. Thank you, Erika, for bringing us all together, and Abigail Adams for hosting us. This is an amazing group, and it's a real privilege. So, yeah, I mean, I sort of have to start by saying yes to everybody so far. I mean, I fell into this. I share Abigail's and Louise's background in regular feminism and gender studies, and particularly the sort of postmodern studies, which Abigail, you write about in your How I Got Here journey in your book. I started out as a card-carrying Butlerite, or at least I was by my mid-20s, a card-carrying Butlerite, and very fixated on the social construction of everything. With hindsight, having gone down the rabbit hole I'll talk about in a moment, I think it's amazing the extent to which that that fixation on how gender is, and even sex is just a performance, really takes for granted what Leah spoke about in her male-normed world. You know, in a sense, it presumes a basic condition of sameness from which we can all perform ourselves as we see fit, including our genders as we see fit. Which simply kind of forecloses from the word go the possibility that people's hands might be normatively a different size, such as to make tools or cars more or less comfortable to use, and so on and so forth. Where I fell off the wagon with queer theory and the rest was having a baby. I mean, I think this is a common story. You know, you smoke the everybody is the same pipe until you have a baby, and you realize that at a very literally visceral level, you're just not. I mean, my response and my husband's response to gestation are self-evidently different. I was the one with a literal baby in my entrails. Our response to her arriving was different. And my whole psychological makeup changed to a very radical degree. You know, a whole bunch of stuff which I thought was important before just wasn't anymore. You know, the only time I've ever crashed a car in something like 20 years of driving was with a hungry baby screaming in the back. And there's no way of explaining that except with a whole load of very basic stuff, which makes total sense from an animal point of view. But no sense at all from the male normed radical egalitarian. We're indistinguishable homunculi piloting meat suits with slightly different genital topography point of view. You know, that just has no way of accounting for what's going on there. So I had a baby, and then, I mean, I had a lot of time. I was a stay-at-home mum at the time, so I spent a lot of that time pushing a pram around a small town and kind of thinking about all of this. And where that took me, I suppose, to cut a fairly long train of thought fairly short, I ended up going down quite a long political and historical rabbit hole, and coming to the conclusion that the entire frame of sex egalitarianism is structurally predicated on technological changes, which are in turn structurally predicated on the Industrial Revolution. And that's and at which point I ran slap bang into a kind of something which really did feel solid in this very sort of wibbly wobbly business of trying to understand what sex and gender is, and how we can really find something concrete as a concrete basis on which to talk about the enormous changes in how we think about what men and women are, and how we should relate to one another. And that led me, very long story short, to writing the book, which I've just finished, which comes out in the UK in March, Feminism Against Progress, where I've framed the history of feminism as one of technological transitions. Now, in this I owe a tremendous debt to Erika, who makes a persuasive case for the relationship between the emergence of feminism and the transition out of pre-modern agrarian life into an industrial one, and particularly in the split that occasioned between work and home, which was just not generally the case for women prior to that. I mean, if you're a subsistence farmer or an artisan, you know, it's just balancing work and childcare is just it's a completely different proposition than if you are or you could be working in a factory, you know. So yeah, so I found myself framing the whole history of feminism like in those terms, and then again I owe a tremendous debt to Erika for the piece which really brought the whole picture together. Because for a while I was sort of wrestling with this, thinking, well, if the early history of feminism is one of tech transitions, then what does that look like when we get to the 20th century? You know, what happens, because there's this second wave, which is, you know, and if when you get these enormous renegotiations of how men and women relate, you know, to some extent that's a response to enormous tech transitions. What is the tech transition in the mid 20th century, which we're talking, what's the tech transition? You know, if we can infer from the fresh outbreak of feminism that there's another tech transition, what is it? And I conclude, I mean, it's staring us in the face. It's what Louise has just written about. It's the pill. And from there, and fast forwarding, because I realize I'm running short on time, I came to the conclusion that if we want to understand where we've got to now in terms of the women's movement, we need to understand that the fertility technologies which emerged in the mid 20th century were, in a sense, the end of feminism on the industrial model. You know, in a sense of trying to negotiate the roles of men and women and family life in the context of industrial era technologies, you know, manufacturing and so on. Because in fact, we found ourselves in a new era, which is to say the era of biological technologies, medical technologies, which Jennifer has just spoken about very powerfully, and her work is focused on, and also the digital revolution. And so the rest of my account of where we are really sort of takes it forward from the basic premise that the 1960s was the end of feminism as we understand. There's a radical discontinuity there, and because we've entered a new age, we no longer live in the industrial era. We live in what I think of as the cyborg era, or to put it more plainly, the transhumanist era. And in fact, the contraceptive pill, is the first transhumanist technology, in the sense that it seeks to improve on normal rather than being an ameliorative medical technology. It's an effort to upgrade normal. And once you accept that premise, once you accept that it's legitimate and appropriate to upgrade normal wherever you wish, it opens the door to theoretically limitless upgrades on human normal. And if you like, a deregulation of human nature and potentially limitless commercial patenting, exploitation, and again, tremendously asymmetrical benefits and harms, depending on where you sit in the social hierarchy or what your embodiment is in your political situation and so on. So really where I see this work as important is in understanding how we got here, and how, to an extent, this sort of biolibertarianism has emerged out of and is implicated, with feminism and the liberation from our limits through technology are very deeply implicated with one another. But it doesn't follow from that we have to throw it all out. But what we really need to do is re-engage with what we're trying to achieve, you know, as women and as men and women together. You're trying to live in some sort of healthy and flourishing way, and really try and get to grips with what these technologies are and what they're doing, and with the wider transhumanist implications of them, which is to say, you know, avoid the danger of just getting bogged down in, for example, the transgender debate, and to understand the transgender debate as if you like, the bow wave of transhumanism, and really to, as Helen has done superbly in her book, follow some of the money back to the advocates who are pushing this stuff on the legislative front, and understand potentially what some of their interests would be. You know, to do the investigations Jennifer is doing in the enclosure and commodification of women's fertility, and really to explore where that medical research is going more broadly. So if I think there's a feminist and also a much broader political case, it's for asking those hard questions, you know, about really what we can and what we should. And yeah, I'll leave it there, because I think I'm over time already. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That was excellent. Great connections there between the previous speakers. And I think Helen, who will be our next speaker, really builds on a lot of that collision course of technology and the gender paradigm that Abigail also spoke about. So
thank you very much for having me on, especially since I didn't see your first email, and thank you for persisting. I think this is a fantastic initiative. I'll be very, very brief in talking about, you know, how I got into this, because I think I've said it before, and I think my book came out before some of the other books that people here are mentioning. So, you know, it's old news now. Briefly, I was an academic mathematician. I then worked at The Economist, and then I stumbled across the idea that people were saying boys could be girls and men could be women, and it immediately snagged my interest on a very theoretical level, because it was immediately obvious that the definition of woman as anyone who identifies as a woman is a vacuous, circular definition. So I have a very nerdy way of coming into it. It wasn't because I knew they were transitioning children or something at first, that had never crossed my mind. But also I had no idea of anything to do with queer theory or anything that had happened in feminism. I'm older, I think, than everyone else of the panelists here. I'm 54, and my degree and my PhD were in mathematics. So I was completely, I'd never heard of Judith Butler, literally never heard of her. And my life was better for it. So I was amazed from the start, as opposed to having been embedded in the whole gender stuff and then coming out. The Economist was, great place to try and explain these ideas, much less captured than other parts of the media. I continued to work there until middle of last year, roughly. I took a long leave of absence then from The Economist to work with Sex Matters, which is a relatively startup non-profit, which is much more basic than feminism. It's not a feminist organization because it's for everybody. It's basically just saying there are two sexes and that has consequences. And yes, I completely agree with what Leah says about how there's the male norm and the female other, but men need sex-based rights too. And we don't need to talk about it for quite a while, but you don't need to get to the woman bit of it for quite a while. So we're doing kind of foundational or basic work underpinning, like trying to re-strengthen the foundation upon which other people can do their work. And we see that for us, it's not the only arena for this, but for us, it's a lot about the law. So we're trying to stop the erasure of sex in law, or the sorts of exceptions that are put in, like even if you have the words male and female still there, you say that female is anyone who identifies as female. And we're, I think, in a much better place than in the US, but so much work to do and such constant attempts to destroy these foundational pillars of our laws and our practices. So for a lot of people, this is a sort of a fight within feminism, and I can see that, and I don't disagree with it, but it's not my framing. And I think that the framing for me is that, again, as Sex Matters is not fundamentally a feminist organization, what motivates me is not fundamentally feminist, although I think of myself as a feminist and a sex-realist feminist. To me, what's happening when you destroy something as fundamental as male and female is you're destroying meaning, the ability to make meaning, the ability to make policy, arguments, ideas, understanding. You're actually destroying institutions. So I see this as a battle to save institutions. It's extraordinary to me how institutions have been flipped 180 degrees from what they set out to do. You have the ACLU now arguing against free speech. You have safeguarding organizations trying to sack people who say that you're allowing men to, have intimate access to girls on the grounds that those men call themselves women. They're literally arguing against their foundational principles because they broke something fundamental when they introduced a definition that is circular. And this, I think, is why, as a mathematician, I came into this fight. I saw that if you say, you have one false equation, 1 0 = 1, somewhere in your entire mathematical universe, you screw up everything. It cascades through your whole mathematical world. And that's why I noticed, without ever having heard of Judith Butler. I should say other reasons why I never fell for any of this sort of stuff, apart from never having heard of it. I'm the eldest of 9 children. I knew I always wanted children. I was in fact infertile, and my own children are both by IVF. And, one of the trans activist talking points is, well, what about infertile women? Well, when my husband and I went to the fertility clinic, they did not ask me for a sperm sample, and they did not do any internal investigations on him. They did on me. It was a very sexed experience. I want to sort of say 2 other very short things before I stop, which are disconnected, but they're responses to things that other people said. I've read Mary's wonderful book in manuscript, and I agree with her completely about this extraordinary way in which technology has changed what feminism is. But I would say, I would see it as markets. It's not just technology, it's markets. And Mary says this, it's the intrusion of markets in places that markets weren't. So you could plausibly describe the Industrial Revolution as a market revolution. It brought a lot of production out of the home where it was not market into a world where things were bought and sold. And we've done that over and over again. And now, post the pill and with the internet, we've moved dating into a market. We have, and when you start thinking about that way, you start thinking about prostitution in a different way. You start thinking about sugar daddies and so on. You start thinking about surrogates and surrogacy. And to me, I think that's a valuable framing that I hope we can add to the technological one, that this is the latest market revolution. And the thing about markets is they're like a solvent. I mean, you know, to talk in Adam Smith terms, the two most famous books are The Wealth of Nations, where he talks about the invisible hand, and The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he talks about the bits of the world that aren't within the market. And when something moves out of the non-market and into the market, markets, wow, they are so powerful. Like, they do great things for us. They bring us things all around the world, but they just dissolve any attempt to create a boundary. And that's why we've seen such fast moves to people dating online and Tinder and so on. And then the other thing I would just say is a thought about this question of social constructionism. Because I never got any training in queer theory or anything like that, I've tried to read on it since. And it just seems so stupid to me that it's hard to believe that people as clever as Mary and Abigail could ever have believed this stuff, but you did. So I obviously am not understanding something here. And I've kept thinking on and on and on about it. And I think the useful contribution I can make is to think, you know, mathematics is also hyper theoretical and hyper separated from the real world. Like, I lived in a world where I was working in infinite dimensional spaces and writing papers that nobody read. But the thing about mathematics is it's in the title of a 1960s paper that's very famous, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. Or as I think it was Galileo said, that mathematics is the language in which God wrote the universe. So maths keeps working even though it's super abstract. And I would say that queer theory, the equivalent is the unreasonable ineffectiveness of queer theory, because it just doesn't do anything for you the way that mathematics does. And that, to me, is where we can hopefully add something intellectual, like to really explain why queer theory, it doesn't work. You could throw the whole thing out and it would help. It would make no difference to anything except good things. Whereas mathematics, you would just keep reinventing it if you threw it out. Sorry, that was a bit disconnected, but anyway.
No, that's a very interesting point about that correspondence or lack of correspondence to reality. And you also mentioned earlier on with your work with Sex Matters that we need to focus not only on women but on men. And I think that's something that our next panelist, Nina Power, has done quite a bit. So I'll hand it over to you, Nina.
Thanks. And thanks for having me on at last minute. And yeah, very interesting to listen to everybody. I somehow agree with all of these positions as well. I wanted maybe just to start with a brief story about how to answer the question, how we came to a sex realist position, as it were. And I think it was a position that we did have in the 90s. Like, I do think the second wave ideas trickled down even into rural primary schools and secondary schools, which is to say a basic assumption that sex is real but is not determinant of character, right? So the idea that basically boys and girls could be sort of almost anything, right? But that's not to deny biological reality. Like, we still had separate sex ed classes, I recall, but there was a kind of freeing up perhaps in terms of gender roles, right? So, you know, you could be a boyish girl, like many of us were, tomboy, and you'd be interested in sort of typically masculine things and vice versa, right? So in that sense, I mean, we can talk about the word progressive, but there was a moment, I think, from the 70s, maybe to the late 90s or early 2000s, maybe a bit later, where there was a genuine sense of social progression, which is to say an opening up. And, you know, there are market forces here. These are economic things too. The mass entry of women into the workforce in the 20th century, various technological innovations. And I think we've seen a kind of making proximate of men and women, right? Men and women are now more like brother and sister. And I've tried to write about the kind of almost a complicated word, but the kind of death of a certain kind of patriarchy, which is to say a hierarchical relationship of responsibility and taking care. And the market has generated instead men and women who are more infantilized, more consumerist, and more similar to one another, right? So in terms of dating habits, a kind of compulsion or being compelled to treat each other in similar ways, being treated in a similar way by employers. So there's a sense of proximity. Ivan Illich talks about this in his very infamous cancelled book from the early 80s called Gender, which he uses the term in a very different way. But there's a sort of becoming homogenous of the human, right, which goes along with some of these technological things, right? But it's fundamentally untrue, right? We are sexually dimorphic. We are extremely different in the ways that people have been mentioning. And from my point of view as someone who's trained in philosophy, what we've seen is the sort of shutdown of various kinds of discussion. And I think there are various tipping points for me, or peak moments, or whatever people say around this discussion, where I realized that this whole the whole dimension of thought was becoming extremely regressive, right? If we want to say the 90s was still part of the second wave, and there was a kind of equality indifference, we seem to be reverting to stereotypes being presented as a great leap forward, and a very imagistic idea of what it meant to be a woman. And various things started to seem very, very peculiar. And one of the great tipping points for me, I think, was the Rebecca Tuval moment in 2017, which she published as a philosopher. Philosophers engage in thought experiments all the time. We're very annoying. This is sort of what we do. We have provocative ideas and we write them down and we see if they work, or what, whether ideas can be compared. She wrote a positive paper comparing transgenderism to transracialism, and she kind of pushed the boat out and said, oh well, if we permit one socially, what about the other? And she was wildly and widely attacked. That something like 2,000 people signed a letter against her. Hypatia turned her back, even though they'd approved the article. And it was a perfectly reasonable paper, right, as a thought experiment. And she was absolutely hounded. And I think that it's always in the minor details that these things really hit, I think. So what happened was someone else, I think Kelly Oliver, great feminist philosopher, was writing about the case, and she said that people who signed the letter against Rebecca Tuval were secretly and privately messaging her to say, I'm really sorry, but I had to be seen to sign that letter. And I think at that moment, one of many, but this really struck me as like, oh my God, what the hell is happening here? You have people publicly lying because they're afraid, and they want to keep their jobs, and they don't want to be seen to be speaking out or defending this young scholar who'd actually written a good article that was perfectly reasonable. And I just thought, this is going to be the death of philosophy, right? This is the death of dialogue, the death of thought. If we can't say these things, if we can't have discussions around what we mean by certain concepts, this is going to cause huge problems for law, as we see, right? This is where the concepts play out. Right, if we don't have working concepts of male and female, man and woman, right, and if we just say, oh, these are floating signifiers and they can mean anything, right, this has huge ramifications, as we know, for social political life. There are all these different levels and layers in which these concepts are being used. So I could see this erosion of thought, and not to mention the way in which people were being no platformed, this idea that you can't debate certain things. It's like, no, of course we can talk about anything, and everybody is a philosopher. Everyone has the right to think, or the capacity to think, and to question things that are being proposed. So that was, the general context. And I suppose I wrote this book, which is about men ostensibly, but it's really about the relationship between men and women, because what I wanted to look at was not only the capacity that we each have to be good men and women, right? Because I think a lot of these discussions are absented of moral aspects or questions of virtue. We live in almost like a post-virtuous age in which things like desire is like whatever people want is good, which is the kind of logic of a 2-year-old, and that's offensive to 2-year-olds. This kind of infantilized, immature culture where everyone is being encouraged just to sort of get what they want. This cannot be sustainable at the level of how we interact and how we treat each other. And I think part of the attack on men, and this is contentious, I understand, but the erosion of the idea of what it means to be a good man and a good woman means that there cannot be, there is an attempt to erase any form of solidarity or companionship, or a kind of relationship in our difference, which is a positive one, which we need to have parents who have and take responsibility for children. So we see the erosion of the relationship between men and women, the definition of man and woman, or and male and female, and also the sanctity of childhood, right? We see they're all related, right? And partly this is technological, partly this is market-based, but partly is political and social. And it's a very dangerous reversal of particular concepts, right? So the idea that children know best, for example, is an absolutely terrible idea, must be resisted. Children need to be protected. But in order for children to be protected, we need men and women to be adults, and we need them to be good men and good women. So I think there's a whole, everything is sort of connected and we're up against it in lots of different directions. But I think there is hope, and I think there's a lot of reasonable and sensible people have been absolutely doing their best and their damnedest to stay reasonable and to stay clear in the face of unbelievable mobbing and cancelling, and I'm sure all of us have experienced some degree of that over the past few years. But I think there is a limit. You can't push reality too far before it snaps back.
Thank you, Nina. Now last, I'm going to hand the mic over to Erika.
Thank you all so much. I think the individual and combined brilliance of the women here on this panel itself is a real testament to the importance of this venture. I've learned so much from all of you today, but then also in all of your work. Really, really grateful you're all here. I want to say a couple of remarks by way of kind of summary before we open it to discussion, and just do want to say to our audience that I think one or two of our panelists will be leaving before discussion, but then the rest of us will be staying until 15 minutes past the hour just to talk a bit about what we've been saying. So the study of the ancients, in terms of my quick story, the study of the ancient philosophy is really what pulled me away from women's studies and the Women's Center that I helped to lead as a college student in the mid-1990s. And I still find that the ancients have so much to offer. So though I'm certainly not going to claim that everyone on this panel holds to the same metaphysics or epistemology, or even would claim one, I will say with some confidence that sex-realist feminism, by offering an account of the real with regard to human beings, rejects, as we've heard many say, post-structuralism, the kind of Judith Butler stuff, even as we can also learn from some of those insights. Likewise, as we've heard too, sex-realist feminism also rejects kind of stridently liberal or libertarian accounts that view radical autonomy or unfettered choice as kind of the highest good of human life. And I think for pushing back on these modern and postmodern errors in some way, feminists like us are often accused of being essentialists, as though our convictions about the sexually dimorphic nature of the human species means we ascribe to fixed or retrograde accounts of the roles and contributions of women and men in society. But from our perspective, as I think Abby said, it's actually, I think, trans ideology that trades in really rigid gender stereotypes by kind of essentializing masculine and feminine as somehow within a gendered mind or soul, which is the seat of the identity in this view, to which kind of our instrumentalized body parts must be made to conform. So as I explore a bit in my book, The Rights of Women, this account of the sexed soul is an old Rousseauian concept that was outright rejected by the proto-feminist Mary Wollstonecraft in favor of an integrated, rational human soul on which human equality is grounded and our asymmetrically sexed bodies. So I think Rousseau's essentialism is a kind of precursor to the gender essentialism to which we subject children when we now ask them to choose their sex based on whether they like kind of ponies, ballet, and lipstick, or sports and trucks. But if there is a way in which I think Wollstonecraft and the first wave of feminists who followed her can be considered kind of essentialists, if I am an essentialist, it's insofar as we believe that women are essentially human, endowed with the intellectual and volitional capacities that differentiate humans from the lower animals. That women are human, after all, was the chief claim of feminism's first wave. Our rational human powers enable women, like men, to be the protagonists of our own lives, not mere subjects or playthings at the hands of men, which is basically what Rousseau thought. But for these first feminists and for the sex-realist feminists too, men and women are not rational and volitional ghosts in kind of Cartesian machines, but rather rational animals who are essentially embodied. Our bodies are not tools for manipulation, but are an essential aspect of who we are as human beings. And so to be respected as equals, as some have already spoken about, women and men's distinctive bodies, asymmetrical bodies, have to be respected too. Human beings are not feminine or masculine kind of spirits that carry around our bodies like a suitcase, as Angela Franks, one of our featured authors, has put it. We are our bodies, however dependent or vulnerable or fertile or infertile or ill or mortal our bodies render us. But we are the bodies of sexually dimorphic human beings oriented to a shared and dignified human end, our own personal and communal flourishing. And what human flourishing entails is, of course, a subject of important debate in the modern world among the women on this panel, and will be in the pages of our new journal as well. So with all that, I open up the panel to discussion. I think we have about 14 minutes before we sign off. If anybody would like to, I know Mary has to leave soon. So Mary, if you want to chime in, if you have anything to say, or anybody else, just feel free to unmute yourself and speak away.
Thank you for those words, Erika. Just to complicate things, I don't actually reject post-structuralism. I just think they're all doing it wrong. I think most of what flies under that banner is in fact just a very tantrumy kind of high modernism that has decided to destroy all meaning because it can't have stable meanings. I don't think post-structuralism is at all incompatible with realizing that the world exists. So I suppose I'd say I'm a fully paid up post-structuralist. I'm just not a nominalist. And I think we could fairly say that about everybody here. We are not nominalists. The world is there. It's real. You know, maybe there's a huge amount of social construction that goes into what we think that means. And I think some of that discussion will happen here, that the world it's there, it's happening.
Can I come in on that?
Yes, absolutely, please. Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot about this sort of, you know, there is nothing beyond the word, or there is no outside the word sort of thing. And I you know, think it just seems so obvious that one thing that you could say to somebody who's caught in that mindset is, okay, I'm going to drop 2 human beings on a desert island and I'll come back in 5 years and see is there another little human being or not. And the predictions that you can make just have nothing to do with words. They would hold even if human beings had never learned to talk. If we were just apes, they would hold even if we were just hamsters, or, you know, any mammal sort of thing. And that seems to me to be so obviously a thing outside the word, and a commentary on the text that's outside the text, or, you know, whatever the proper translation of this is. I'm not the queer theorist. I just sort of wonder how any of this ever bloody well took off.
I do want to jump in for a second because I see there are 2 questions in the Q&A, and I want to give those people a little bit of a shot and just take a little swing at Casey's question. We've kind of got 2 questions now, but I'm going to take your first one, Casey, about the difference between sameness and difference feminism, and where we see sex-realist feminism as fitting in. I'm strongly pro difference feminism, where men and women are different in various important ways and equal in dignity, and that difference isn't a threat to our equality and dignity. But I think we tend to start from the premise in a lot of modern conversation that the basis of equality and dignity has to be a kind of isomorphism, that people are equivalent to each other. And if they're not equivalent, they can't be equal. You know, I see this even sometimes in the pro-life movement, where a lot of the advocacy for babies in the womb comes from, well, they're almost the same as people everywhere else, or babies after birth, you know. So a baby can hear by this point, so they must be all right. A baby, you know, can do this thing. It's an argument that starts from they're almost equivalent, so let's make sure we say they have rights, versus just saying because they're human, they have rights, and they don't have to be exactly interchangeable with the baby after birth. They don't have to be exactly interchangeable with me. I think this kind of sameness, not just feminism, but sameness anthropology, is what leaves us at risk of cutting people out of the human family when they're very young, when they're very old, when they're women. That as long as equality is premised on equivalency, many people won't be equivalent to the standard human we're thinking of. So I think advocating for difference feminism isn't just good for women, it's good for all human beings who aren't all swappable with each other. So thank you for that question, Casey.
Yeah, I guess kind of bringing together both Helen and Leah's comments, I wonder, Abby, if you would be able to address, you know, a lot of you panelists mentioned your interests and your experiences surrounding childbirth and motherhood in particular. And I always sort of think about that as being a time when reality slaps you in the face, right? And that women's bodies kind of make it harder to fall into maybe structuralism, post-structuralism done badly, as Mary says. But Helen was asking how, if it is so obvious because of our bodies that some of these ideas are wrong. Oh no, did Abby disappear? I was going to ask her. Oh no, there you are. Get married. How did that idea become so incredibly influential in our culture, both in the academy and kind of in pop culture? how did this sort of anti-realist strand of feminism rise to ascendancy?
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that has kind of been proposed by many of the panelists. I think there's kind of a twin revolution that's happened in the last century, which is a conceptual revolution, so a changing in the concepts, but that unfolds in tandem with a contraceptual revolution, right? So I'm in agreement with Mary that we can't underestimate the way that widespread embrace of contraception has shifted our cultural imagination. So for example, I remember I was in a doctoral seminar once, and there was a female doctor there who was trying to get a PhD to understand why so many of her patients who'd had children before were, she prescribed them birth control, but they would still end up pregnant. And so she was like, what's going on here? Why do they have this kind of magical thinking about their own bodies? And what's interesting to me now, which no one in that seminar raised this possibility, but which seems more obvious to me now, is that it's actually the use and embrace of contraception itself can change our awareness of our own fertility, right? And I think that has happened in our culture. So as maleness and femaleness, or womanhood and manhood, has become divorced from generativity, then what's left to define it? Well, it's much more about appearance. It's much more about what kinds of things, and this is where consumerism comes in, what kinds of things you buy, what kinds of things you wear. And so I think all of these forces that we've been talking about, the technological, the market-driven forces, have, as well as this kind of conceptual change in what womanhood and manhood mean. It's like this perfect storm, basically. So that's kind of my thought.
That's really interesting, that idea of the technology kind of blinding ourselves to the reality of our own bodies. And it also makes me think of the question of gender roles, because I think about research on low-income women, like it Promises I Can Keep, for example, is a good sociological study of these women who would on purpose become mothers as teens, for example. But there's that longing for someone to be dependent upon you, that relational aspect. And I wonder if that connects at all, Nina, to the kind of questions you deal with about roles for men and women to become good men and women that aren't sort of rigid essentialist,
right,
but do have a normative aspect, right?
Yeah. So I think there's lots of kind of maybe slightly paradoxical seeming things going on here. Like, I mean, so just to go to the essentialist point, I mean, it's not essentialist to say that men and women are different and they have different bodies, because it doesn't tell you anything about how you live out your character or your existence, right? And I think this is somehow being forgotten, and we've forgotten that character building and personality is what makes you who you are. I mean, but it doesn't change your sex, right? So instead you end up with identities that are totally detached, and we have this mind-body split and all this Gnostic stuff, which is, encouraged by a virtual universe, right? Where you can sort of pretend to be anything, right? Like, so we're in this kind of Gnostic world. But I think the larger question, one of the bigger questions about this flattening out and this homogeneity, which seems to be eliminating difference through technology, through the market, so on, is to do with the death of something that isn't us, right? Like, you could say the death of God, you could say that the idea of the absence of hierarchy, there's no longer any order. There is a sense in which we have come to imagine in our modernity that we are somehow the ground of ourselves, which is why we also don't look back to our ancestors as much. We somehow think that we live in the present, that we know everything, we're the greatest generation of human beings that ever lived. There's a total cutting off of the wisdom and history. You can see this in the destruction of history as well. I mean, the fact that people are just making stuff up, however they want history to be. So I think there's a much, much larger question which tells us something about the destruction of male and female, or man and woman as concepts and realities, or the attempted destruction, which is to do with the destruction of order in its entirety, and a fear of order and not being grounded by oneself, which is a fundamentally chaotic and even sort of satanic position, if I might use this word with caution.
I guess to conclude, I guess I'll open it up if anyone has any final thoughts that they they really want to share. And otherwise, I will hand it over to Erika. Do you have any final thoughts on this question of fair disputations role going forward? Are we bringing up the banner of difference feminism again? Are we doing something a little new and different? What do you think?
Yeah, does anybody else, Helen, do you want to jump in before? Yeah, please.
I just have a hope that you will publish things that other people won't. You know, there's so much important work that doesn't get published because people are too scared. And then you get these awful emails from people, which I think one of the panelists mentioned, that people get onto you behind the scenes and say, I'm sorry I couldn't do that, or I'm sorry I couldn't back you. You're completely right, but I don't dare do it. And I sometimes feel that those of us who work in this space and who are named, yes, okay, we're giving a voice to other people, but I also get quite cross on occasion because I feel like we're acting as a sort of confessional that people who are paid to do this work, people who have good jobs, they maybe have tenure, they work for government, you know, they tell us, those of us who are out in this space, some of whom are unpaid campaigners, and then they think that it's fine. They've handed on their sins, and now they continue doing their job without actually doing their job. And we're meant to fix it. But one of the places that happens is absolutely in academic publishing. And there are important papers that don't get published and absolute junk that does. And not just on feminism, on the medicine that's related to this, on detransition, all those sorts of things. I hope that you can help to change that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely it. And one of the reasons we wanted to bring together sort of all these big names, you could say, as featured authors, though, of course, we hope you'll all write for us as well, but really is also to kind of, you know, be the place where fresh voices are platformed. And so I hope those of you who are watching or any of the featured authors here will send us, you know, those people who have nice, good, strong, well-argued material to write, and that we can publish that. So I'm so grateful to all of you. We'll leave some questions there. I think one of the important parts of this is that we don't, you know, we agree on really important things, but there's some things that we don't agree on, and that those things may or may not be debated in our pages sometimes. But it's really important for us all to come together and to learn from one another. And I really look forward to working with all of you. And thank you to our audience and to those who watch us in the future as this is recorded. And we'll all sign off now. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.